Well, next on our schedule this morning, we have John Hofmeister. John Hofmeister is a key member of the United States Energy Security Council, a bipartisan group which includes former Secretary of State George P. Shultz and two former Secretaries of Defense, William J. Perry and Harold Brown, as well as three former national security advisors, a former CIA director, two former senators, a Nobel laureate, a former Federal Reserve chairman, and several Fortune 50 chief executives. Upon retirement from Shell Oil Company in 2008, Mr. Hofmeister founded and heads the not-for-profit nationwide membership association, Citizens for Affordable Energy. This Washington, D.C. registered public policy education firm promotes sound U.S. energy security solutions for the nation, including a range of affordable energy supplies, efficiency improvements, essential infrastructure, sustainable environmental policies, and public education on energy issues. As Shell president, Mr. Hofmeister launched an extensive outreach program, unprecedented in the energy industry, to discuss critical global energy challenges. The program included an 18-month, 50-city engagement program across the country, during which Hofmeister led 250 other Shell leaders to meet with more than 15,000 businesses, community and civic leaders, policymakers, and academics to discuss what much must be done to ensure affordable, available energy for the future. A business leader who has participated in the inner workings of multiple industries for over 35 years, Hofmeister also has held executive positions in General Electric, Nortel, and Allied Signal. Hofmeister also served as chairman of the National Urban League and is the chairman of the U.S. Department of Energy's Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technical Advisory Committee. He serves as the non-executive director of Hunting PLC, London, UK, AP+, Barcelona, Spain, KMAC Industry Incorporated in Houston, and serves on the advisory board of Liberty Power for Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the nation's largest minority-owned power company. He also serves on the boards of Fuel Freedom Foundation, the National Energy Security Council, the Foreign Policy Association, Strategic Partners, and the Gas Technology Institute. Mr. Hofmeister is a fellow of the National Academy of Human Resources. He is also the past chairman and serves as Director Emeritus of the Greater Houston Partnership. He is active in education, serving as a Wrigley Scholar, Executive in Residence in the Global Institute of Sustainability at Arizona State University. He also serves on the Energy Advisory Board at the University of Houston. Mr. Hofmeister earned a bachelor's and master's degree in political science from Kansas State University. In May 2010, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters from the University of Houston. John Hofmeister is the author of Why We Hate the Oil Companies, Straight Talk from an Energy Insider. Would you welcome to the podium Mr. John Hofmeister.
Good morning, everyone. I'm part of that entrenched industry that Bob told you about. You know, when the world is producing 96.5 million barrels a day of oil, and the demand for that oil is only 95 million barrels a day, that 1.5 million barrel a day surplus is oil that no one wants because their tanks are full. That has a dramatic impact on the oil price. This morning I checked, ethanol was selling wholesale for $1.37. Gasoline, $1.02 wholesale. That makes a pretty tough, competitive situation when you're selling your product at a higher price than gasoline. And so I thought I'd start by talking about the oil price. And what does that mean for you all as fuel producers? And then move a little bit down the path of the future of fuel supply, and then end the talk with a little different subject, a subject that I believe goes to the heart of what's wrong with fuel and energy in America, the heart of the issue. But let's consider, first of all, how did the oil price get to $27 a barrel? There are all kinds of theories out there, and so I think I'm entitled to offer you my theory. My theory is a little bit different than the mainstream lower for longer argument that we simply have a global imbalance of supply versus demand. Because I start from the premise, ladies and gentlemen, that oil is a contrived market. It is not a competitive input-output supply versus demand marketplace. And here's the reason. In November 2014, one man in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia made the executive decision that with the upcoming OPEC meeting in Vienna, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would take the position of not reducing oil production. There were a couple of important reasons for that decision, but the most significant reason for the decision, in my opinion, is that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was facing a threat that it has not faced in its modern history. And that threat is the hegemony, the coalition, the combination of interests between Iran and Russia in the Middle East. That combination of interests between Iran and Russia in the Middle East represents a mortal threat to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And as a consequence of what I would describe as a disastrous foreign policy position of the United States of America, for the first time in 60 years, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is facing a future that they see where they cannot count on the United States of America. And on the basis of that fearful position of not understanding why the United States threw out Mubarak, or allowed him to be thrown out, failed to meet the red line promise in Syria, failed to meet the forces agreement, or to come through with a forces agreement for Iraq, failed to figure out what to do about Libya, other than to support the overthrow of Gaddafi, and then, behind the scenes, does an unprecedented deal with Iran on nuclear weapons. The kingdom is saying, we're on our own. We are on our own. What do we do about it? We have one tool in our toolkit, oil price. Oil price has an economic clout that the world should never underestimate. And so if the oil price drops, we can have a significant negative impact on the economies of Iran and Russia, who require very high oil prices to meet the economic requirements of their governments and their societies. Some estimate Iran needs as much as $140 a barrel. Some estimate Russia needs as much as $120 a barrel to meet the economic requirements of a system that is dependent upon a contrived oil price. How'd you like to wake up in the morning in Tehran realizing that instead of $140 a barrel, you're facing $27 a barrel square in the face? How'd you like to wake up in Moscow when you realize you need $120 a barrel and you're facing $27 a barrel? The ruble is half what it was. The economies of Iran and Russia are being wrecked by this low oil price. And yes, they're pumping more. They're pumping more because they need every dollar they can get to pay whatever bills they can pay. And the kingdom is paying a fortune to sustain their own production by the loss of revenue that they need to run their government and their society. This is a contrived situation, ladies and gentlemen, in my view, that has been created because of geopolitical considerations, externalities that do not really align with the so-called market share argument, and which can't last very much longer, because too many calamities are coming at the kingdom, which has already spent hundreds of billions of dollars propping up their current system off their sovereign wealth in the face of low oil prices, and sold hundreds of billions of bonds that will one day be redeemed. The U.S. shale is collateral damage, but the U.S. shale isn't controlled by the U.S. government, and U.S. companies know how to adapt to cost pressure. They shut down rigs, they shut down equipment, they lay off people. We've been through cycles like this before because oil has been a contrived market for a very long time. So you think, what does all this have to do with ethanol? I think it has everything to do with the United States' absolute requirement to become fully energy independent, to not be the victim of a contrived oil market, to not be victimized by the necessity of importing oil to get through the day. Today we'll import 7 million barrels of oil. And instead of importing oil to get through the day, why aren't we developing on a strategic, planful basis the alternative fuels that we have in this country that can dismiss any dependency on foreign oil forever? Yes, forever. We don't need foreign oil if we fully utilize biomass for making fuel, if we convert natural gas to alternative fuels such as LNG, CNG, ethanol, methanol, GTL, which is a form of diesel. Take advantage of biodiesel. Take advantage of corn-based and other plant-based ethanol. To displace 7 million barrels of oil, ladies and gentlemen, we would produce more of everything. More domestic oil, more domestic natural gas, more domestic biomass fuel. We would need every bit of it. But why wouldn't we want it, rather than to be subject to the vagaries, subject to the manipulation, subject to what is truly a contrived marketplace for oil, which is roughly 96% of all our transportation fuel, when it all is added up, when you include airplanes and trucks and so on. We're not doing the job. Our government has been failing us since Richard Nixon declared energy independence in 1973. And every one of his successors, including the current incumbent, has said, we must move towards energy independence, and once they've said it, they must fall asleep, because nothing happens. We need to produce 30 billion cubic feet of additional domestic natural gas to displace those 7 million barrels of imported oil. And that's counting on maximum production of biomass fuel as well. We can do that. We know the technology. We have the natural gas. We have the capital. We have the people. We've just laid off hundreds of thousands of oil workers in the oil patch, with the 1,100 rigs going down. And the recovery is not going to be significantly quick. Some people think, well, if the oil price rises, we'll just go right back to producing shale. No, we won't. The reason we won't is because we had a broken business model in the oil shale. We grew from 5 million barrels a day production to 10.2 million barrels per day production between 2007 and 2014. That's record increase in production. But you know why the business model was broken? Many of the independent drillers were operating on negative cash flow, depending on their banks to keep funding them to drill more and more and more. You don't have to go much beyond the community college to understand that an economic business model based on negative cash is not going to work. And that's why we're not going to see a rapid recovery. In fact, we're going to see more bankruptcies before we see any recovery in the oil patch, because the banks have had it. They're not going to tolerate that kind of economic. And the supply chain is broken. We have cut costs so quickly, so dramatically, that the supply chain to supply bringing rigs back into operation, bringing pump trucks back into operation, that supply chain is in sorry, sorry shape. Inventories have been cannibalized. Rigs set aside have been cannibalized in order not to buy new equipment. Old equipment has been stripped from those rigs, from those trucks, to avoid spending cash, to keep the 500 rigs that are still drilling. And the industry's in a mess, because of the contrived oil price. It's not sustainable. But energy independence in the United States is sustainable. But now I get to my second point. It is only sustainable, ladies and gentlemen, and this is radical, if we reimagine, reconceive, and remake what I call the governance of energy. Bob gave a wonderful description of the failure of the United States government and the competing industries to come together on common sense. If anyone wonders why the outsiders in this term's political election are attracting a lot of attention, it's because so many of our fellow citizens are sick and tired of entrenched interests who don't even have common sense in politics, who will not work together on policy that's suitable for America, who think that if it's not Democratic or if it's not Republican, it's no good, while the American people pay the price in between. And we've finally come to a point where voices are now speaking out about it with respect to the need for change. But in my opinion, there is no industry in this country, except maybe healthcare, that requires such root and branch change as the United States energy industry fully writ. This notion of entrenched interests paying money to established politicians to maintain a position when times have changed, when the world has changed, reality has changed, but the power of the status quo rules, is so out of touch with the needs of real people. The power of the status quo be damned in a time of change. And so how do we change government to where it can work? Let me move parallel for a moment. We got ourselves in serious trouble in the 2006, 7, and 8 time period with mortgages. Mortgages that were junk, but sold as AAA financial instruments. We had a machine running called the housing market, which everyone wanted to see become stronger, bigger, better, brighter, more beautiful. And it was being run on a negative cash basis because people who got mortgages couldn't pay their mortgages. And the financial institutions which wrote those mortgages and then sold them off knew they were junk. And so in 2008, the chickens came home to roost, and we paid a huge price. And many people said we are headed over the cliff to a 1930s style depression where nothing works. But we didn't have a 1930s style depression, did we? Because we had a government institution with a 100-year history. At the time, it had a 96-year history. But that financial institution was created in 1913 following the 1907 and the 1912 economic collapse of the U.S. Treasury and the United States economy, refloated by loans from Wall Street because the U.S. government didn't have the funds to do it. And in return, there was a promise made to the industry, you give us money, we'll fix this problem. And the U.S. system responded. How did the U.S. system respond? It created an independent regulatory authority called the Federal Reserve under the Federal Reserve Bank under the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. And while it has not been without controversy, nor has it been a perfect institution, I'm here to tell you, the United States of America is the only benchmark currency in the world. I'm here to tell you, under the guidance of the monetary planning of the Federal Reserve, the United States became the world's, and still is the world's, largest economy in the world. If you're measuring performance, measure the Fed, because the Fed provides the monetary system relief, the amount of money that the system needs, the interest rates, which are the cost of money, the overnight open market window, which is the daily refreshment of money at your local bank that's under the Federal Reserve, and it has the power to intervene as and when it has to. These are written into law. These are statutory responsibilities of the Federal Reserve that the president can't touch because it's law, that the Congress has been reluctant to change because it works. And I talked to my banking industry friends and I said, what would you do if you didn't have the Fed? They said heaven would have to help us because nobody else would. The Federal Reserve sets the big rules for the financial industry. And then the banks and the financial institutions go off and produce products and services that people buy, and they make money. The Federal Reserve does not destroy the economic forces of the market. It enables the economic forces of the market by common sense rule writing, with a board of governors and an expert staff that know what they're doing. They're not perfect. In the 1930s, they shrunk the money supply when they should have expanded it. But in 2008 and 2009, under the leadership of Ben Bernanke, who was a student of the Depression, they knew to expand the money supply. That's called QE1, QE2. They expanded the money supply to avoid the consequences of going down the slippery slope to depression. They cut the interest rate to make money more affordable so more people would use it. The United States Federal Reserve set the example for the rest of the central banks around the world, which have copied the model of the Federal Reserve to save the world from catastrophe because of the mortgage crisis, which was large enough to throw the world into a worldwide recession, which could have become a depression. Well, if we have that kind of a genius to create statutory rules and regulations for an industry as large as the monetary system of this country, can't we do that for the energy system? Instead of the entrenched interests and the gross use of payoff, payola by any other name, only made legal because the people receiving the money get to declare the legality of it, which in my book is nothing but artificial bribery contrived by law to make it legal. But unaccountable money going to support entrenched politicians who can use it for whatever purpose they desire within certain rules of law. Is that democracy? Sorry, I don't read that in the Constitution. Sorry, I don't read that in any of the treatises that have been written about the American system until more recent days, particularly the grotesque amount of money that's now floating through the system. And if anyone wonders how Bernie Sanders is being so successful, just Google Bernie Sanders, Wall Street, Hillary Clinton. You'll get the full story. So what does this mean for energy? Well, I propose a governance change in which Congress creates an independent regulatory authority for energy, including all the electrons produced in this country, including all the molecules produced in this country, just like the Fed covers every dollar bill spent in this country, within a free market for money. And by writing the big rules, let the energy companies compete. But let the big rules make common sense. And common sense to me is national security through energy independence, affordable energy for all citizens, electricity or fuel, affordable, available 24/7, sustainable so that the environment improves, doesn't get worse, and we ultimately achieve a sustainable environment that we hand to our grandchildren and their grandchildren, which is better, not worse, than what we received from our grandparents. Big rules, 4 big rules. 1, make sure we have supply of energy from all sources of energy to meet the needs of the economy and the needs of the citizens. The same way the Fed runs the money supply to meet the needs of the economy and the needs of reducing unemployment. We need the supplies from all sources. And I would add to that, all domestic sources as and when possible, which means universal, because we have more energy than we will ever need in this country. 2, drive efficiency through technology. Wonderful opportunities for efficiency, whether it's the automobile and 54 miles per gallon, or whether it's the new buildings, whether it's the new barn, whether it's the new whatever. We have a lot of opportunity to save energy through use of technology for efficiency. Number 3, make sure our environment is protected from physical, liquid, and gaseous waste. Because if we can't deal with it as human beings, because it's nasty and it's harmful, then it shouldn't be free. We should manage our waste. If we managed our waste, ladies and gentlemen, we wouldn't have this grandiosity surrounding us called global warming, climate change, COP21, because we wouldn't have waste to deal with. And I argue that we manage our waste, these issues that propel politicians to further their grandiose comments about Earth, as if they have some control over it, would be a part of the past. But we could manage our waste, physical, liquid, and gaseous, to zero with time and technology. And 4th, infrastructure. Making sure we have the wherewithal to enable the development of infrastructure, not frustrate it, not disable it, refuse to build it. We've got to have infrastructure, we've got to have a clean environment, we've got to have more efficiency, and we've got to have available energy. We're not going to get it in the current system. The current system is dysfunctional, it is broken, and it is unfixable in its current form. You cannot deny politicians money if you want their support. What do you think, they do it for free? Public service comes at a cost, doesn't it? It hasn't worked for us, ladies and gentlemen. The great ideas that come from the ethanol movement, the great ideas that come from the science of high-octane fuel, the great additions to environmental protection that come from cleaner fuel, whether that's biomass or whether that's natural gas. We can fix all of this. We can become energy independent. We can live a life of affordable fuel. We can create the jobs we need for the next generations. We can use the science that comes from the practical examples from the farm or the oil field, or the science that comes from the universities and the laboratories of our country. And to be blunt, we don't have to live at the mercy, for which there is none, of a contrived oil price that otherwise destroys the nature of our society. But it takes hard work. And that hard work is represented not only in the postcards at your place setting, but in the ongoing and sustained relationship in a representative democracy with the people who run for office. We have to work through them. And that's hard. That's difficult. But I don't see any other solution other than more of the same. And more of the same doesn't help you, it doesn't help this country, it doesn't help the world. And if the U.S. moved towards such a structure, such a governing structure for energy, you could see the rest of the world follow quickly behind. We have it to do for ourselves. Nobody else is going to help us. But ladies and gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for this opportunity to share with you these ideas, to share with you the success that you're enjoying, and the opportunity to make this country what it was destined to be. Thanks for listening.
We do have a couple of minutes, and John has graciously suggested he would take a question or two. So if there is one, we'll slightly turn up the house lights. There are microphones in the aisle I'd ask that you go to if you have a question. Microphone 3.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. Howard Marks with Red Horse Corporation, consultant to the U.S. Department of Energy, Bioenergy Technologies Office. The question about the Saudi price of oil, the refusal of the Saudis to ratchet back production for the reasons you gave, geopolitical reasons. I think you mentioned in your presentation that they're arriving at the point now where it's starting to really make it difficult for their own economy. At what point do the Saudis capitulate? I mean, what is the actual bottom? I mean, seems to me the stock market, U.S. economy is now pegged to the price of oil. As anyone that's an investor knows that. So could you please run through that scenario? How low can it get before it has to start rebounding? Thank you.
We're very much at the mercy of how much pain the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will accept internally, in my opinion. I very carefully say in my opinion, because there are those who will completely reject not only my explanation, but will refute it actively. But having been in the industry for quite a while and having lived around the world and having great and wonderful connections with friends in the kingdom, I have the greatest respect for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and many, many of its government officials who really believe in the future of the world. But they're facing, as I said earlier, a mortal threat. They're trying to defend themselves in a changing world where they used to count on the U.S. government, now they don't, because they can't. And how much longer can they endure the pain of several $100 billion a year of using their sovereign money that has been set aside for future generations? I don't know the answer to that. But I know that the Saudis are committed to future generations. I also know that a reduction in oil production of 3 to 4%, maybe 5%, would yield oil price in the $80 to $100 range. So in other words, if we went from the 96.5 million production, 95 million consumption, to something more in the range of 94 production, 93 production, versus 94, 95 consumption, we would see the oil price reverse rather quickly, a matter of months or weeks, probably months. And so whether the Russians and the Saudis could come to some understanding of not just freezing their current production levels, but actually reducing their production levels quietly, without great public announcements, remains to be seen. But I don't think that the three countries I've mentioned, Iran or Russia or Saudi, can carry on much longer at the price that exists today. And neither can the economies of the rest of the world. Hundreds of billions of dollars of investment are being deferred. This will lead at some point to an enormous snapback in price through natural market forces, because there won't be enough oil because money hasn't been spent to develop future production. And the amount of ethanol in the world is a fraction of the amount needed to substitute for oil that's not there. And so we could either face a snapback where we all walk around with neck braces for months and months because of the rapid rise because the oil is just not being produced, or we could see more of the contrived. But I'm saying, and the key message of today has been, let's not be victims of that contrivance any longer. Let's fix the problem domestically. Thank you for the question. Yes.
John, Bob, this is Jorge Lerdo from Grupo Báltico in Mexico. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. You have spoken about difficulties with your government here in the US. And in Mexico, we are kind of facing the same thing, unfortunately, 10 years after you did. Do you have any suggestions as far as, or recommendations about how we can educate our government and lawmakers so that we can make the ethanol path much, much easier? Thanks.
As a citizen of the United States, I'm sure that the Mexican government would not really look forward to my views for what Mexico should do. However, I have great respect for Pemex, have known many executives in Pemex, and know them to be dedicated, committed, hardworking people like so many of my friends in the U.S. oil and gas industry. To me, there has been a long history of government interference in the normal operations of a company like Pemex. It is, after all, mostly owned by the state of Mexico, or the government of Mexico. And accompanied to that has been a long history of corruption. Corruption, whether it's at the union level, corruption at the supplier level, corruption at the local government level. And so the level of corruption and the level of government control and the lack of allowing the Pemex people to do what they know best to do, which is run an oil company, has interfered. And I think within what I've described is also the solution. Attack the corruption. Reduce the role of government officials who play politics with Pemex. Just like in Venezuela, they play politics with the National Oil Company of Venezuela. And you've got to get politics out of energy. Politics and energy do not mix. I teach my students at ASU and at University of Houston, politics is the death of energy. We've seen it in the US, you see it in Mexico, they see it in Venezuela. Politics is the death of energy. And so by changing the governance model, by allowing companies to do what companies do, which is run their business, making best use of science and technology and people, getting politics out of the energy mix to me is the number one issue we face in society. And in democracies, the only reason we aren't doing it is because we, the citizens, have opted not to. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Bob. Thank you.
John, before you walk off the stage, hold on, John, before you walk off the stage, and begging indulgence from Jeff because he's got a great panel coming up. I want to just bring you really quick back to the United States because you laid out a terrific vision of 4 points that I think make a great deal of sense, and many of us in this room and throughout the energy industry writ large could embrace. and I fully supported the notion of the status quo be damned, but as you look at the current candidates that are out there, do you see anybody that is embracing the kind of all-inclusive energy policy that you'd like to see?
No.
I thought that might be your answer. I saw somebody here on the stage today, though, that clearly reflected the kind of forward-thinking and comprehensive view of energy that I sure wish we could move the discourse to at some point. And I'd love to work with you further to see if we can get those 4 points included in the discourse in the future. But please join me in thanking John one more time. I thought he did a terrific job, and I'm very, very happy.